Welcome everyone to another episode of Frank Finance, where you can get your honest financial information and your questions answered. I'm sorry we haven't been making videos recently. We just went through a move and are preparing for a wedding. With that being said though, I thought it was a good time for us to talk about capital finance, or I like to call it opportunity finance. Imagine yourself having excess funds and you're trying to figure out what you're going to do with it. That's what we're going to talk about with a corporation. So when a corporation has excess funds, they're going to want to potentially spend them today to create future economic benefit. Why would they spend them today? Well, if they don't, they're actually going to have to pay taxes on it and end up losing a portion of what they could have spent today to gain more bang for their buck down the road. So that's one of the options you have, is to use your excess cash flow. What other options do you have? Well, you could issue corporate bonds or issue stock. That would also bring cash in, and that would give you cash to ultimately spend on things that you think would make sense for the strategy of the company. It's a little bit different than personal finance, because not everything you spend money on has tax benefits like a company does. So as we think about it, companies really can spend money on capital finance. They could purchase other companies through M&A work. They could do stock or institutional buyouts. Or the worst of all of them is basically to sit on the funds and not use them, because you lose them to tax. So for today's discussion, I just want to talk about cash flow and how they could use it. And let's assume you have cash on hand. Things that you could be looking at doing is updating your technology platforms. Maybe you want to update how you're billing. Maybe you want to update your call. Maybe you want to update the way that your system syncs with other systems. That would be an example of capital finance. Or maybe you want to use your capital towards buying down rates that you pay for whatever industry you might work in. Pay cash up front so that you have favorable rates in the future. Again, this would be an example of where you're spending money today so that you don't have to spend it later. You could buy out a lease. Maybe you want to invest in building a new product. This could be something that is an add-on or a buy-up to what you have today. Maybe it's an all-new product together. And there's also another component to it. What if you already have a product? This product could be updated so that it could be more marketable in the future, or ultimately sell at a better rate in the future from currently where it's at right now. All right, so let's get into the finance nerd stuff. So as you're thinking about spending capital dollars, there's a couple things that you have to think about. And these are some finance terms that I would consider if you're out there trying to crunch the numbers. The first one that I think is important to understand is your return on investment, ROI. Return on investment is the value of the investment divided by the cost of the investment. So for instance, if you spend $100 on a product and it ultimately returns $110, that's a $10 profit. That's $10 on 100. That's a 10% ROI. Another thing to think about is net present value. So when you think about net present value, the goal of net present value is to ultimately bring the future value back to current state. So let's say that you're going to make that same example I just had. If you have $100 that you spend to gain $10, so the value of that's 110 that you get back. Now let's say you don't get that for 5 years. You can say that your ROI is 10% on it, but you have to go and look at what the net present value is of that gain to bring it back to current state. Because when you think of multiple years and a compounded adjusted growth rate, you really need to bring the net present value into play so that you can make very good decisions on all of the capital options you might have. You also want to think about your payback period. How long is it going to take until it starts to basically break even? ROI is important, but if ROI takes you 5-6 years, the longer the ROI takes to get to, the longer and more riskier a product potentially could be. Because the further the distance, the further the horizon, the more the chances things go wrong, things change, and so forth. All right, so here's the spreadsheet I want to talk through. So on this spreadsheet, on the top, I've got the cash flows. So we could think about how it impacts our physical money. So again, when you have cash flows, you can either sit on it or spend it. If you sit on it, you're going to pay taxes. So most companies think they can do better with it themselves. This company in particular we've got a business plan, 5-year outlook, that anticipates 10 million a year in cash flows. So now you're in the capital team and you're trying to figure out, what can I do with this 10 million per year? So they get a committee together. They create different scenarios out there. So they've got maybe 100 projects that get submitted, and you got to think about which projects are most important. So I'm not going to try to get too deep into that. I'm just going to try to give some examples of how this kind of can play out. So down here, I've only got a couple projects to walk through here. So project one. So project one is going to spend $1 million on the life of it, $250,000 a year is what the plan is, and then ultimately it's going to produce $100,000 in cash flow forever. And so that's project one. Project two is, in order for this company to stay in compliance, they need to spend $5 million today. They spent their $5 million in year one, and that's what this is. It's not going to give them future cash flow, but if they don't, they're going to have risk of fine and penalties. Project three, they've got spending $2.5 million a year, worth basically $7.5 million in total, and it's going to produce $1 million a year in cash flow after completion. So as I'm going through this, before you get into my little example that I wanted to populate, you could see that the cash flows stay at $10 million a year. And then in year 4, we get the lift from project 3, gives us an extra $1 million a year to get up to $11 million. And then project 1 came into play in year 5 to now give us $1.1 million in extra cash flows than we were currently getting, to give us a new run rate in a future year. So that's kind of the concepts, is that today you spend your money so that tomorrow it gives you more money. And it's just, it will take time to ultimately build back. So let's talk about project 1 for 1 second. Spend $1 million, get $100,000 extra in cash flow. That means that it's going to take 10 years to have a payback on that one. Probably not the most appealing, but who knows how long that's going to produce excess cash flows, and maybe that the ROI on that over the 10-year horizon makes perfect sense. Project 2. There really isn't an ROI on this. This is a regulatory requirement for them to stay compliant. They need to spend the money up front. So this one is not really a question on whether you can or can't do it. It's a matter of how big are the fines going to be and your risk versus opportunities on that. Project 3. We ended up spending $7.5 million. We're getting $1 million excess cash flows. Now, that's going to take basically 7.5 years to break even, or the payback period. Now, again, this is an example where maybe it will cap at $10 million and it'll give them basically a 25% right around return on investment. Now, when I look at long horizons like this is why it's important to think net present value. Because if it takes 10 years to pay it back, net present value has to be brought into play when you've got 10, 15, 20 projects to think about. But another thing that capital finance people have to think about, as well as strategic leaders, is so year 1 it went perfect. They in this example I have is for fun here. We spent a total of just under $7.8 million, left about $2 million in cash. They're okay with that. They're going to sit on it, pay taxes on it, and retain it until next year. That's how they planned their business plan. Now year 2 comes around. They didn't have enough cash flow to provide. The business plan changes. They ate up the $2.2 million, and they also burned through another $12 million that they weren't planning on. And this is where forecasting is really important when you're in finance, to start thinking about these things. So now they have a negative cash flow. So when you've got 2 projects in way, now as a company you have to start thinking, do I issue corporate bonds? Do I issue stock? Or do I ultimately just delay the project? This is where, to me, opportunity finance becomes really fun, is because right here is where you come to example of, if you're underway in something, do you treat it as sunk costs? Do you finish it? Do you try to raise funds? So with that being said, I hope you enjoyed my discussion here on capital finance, or what I like to call opportunity finance. Ultimately, we're just trying to figure out what's the best way to keep pushing forward and hit our business goal. Once you get a forecast set and you know what your capital business plan is going to be using per year, then you start marching forward, knowing that there will be hiccups in place. But if they really are important and you don't have the cash, that's when you start hearing stock issuance, bond issuance. So hopefully you enjoyed this video, but till next time, have a good rest of your day.